I think the promises and perils of evangelism are nowhere more on display in the church than in the world of church planting. On the one hand, one of the most often quoted rationales for church planting comes from Fuller's own Peter Wagner, who I took a class with actually in this very auditorium over 25 years ago. Back in 1990, he wrote, "The single most effective evangelistic methodology under heaven is planting new churches." And that's been quoted more times than I can count. And there's many studies, including a 2018 study by the Southern Baptist Convention, that demonstrates how church plants record significantly more conversions and baptisms per attender than established churches. Now, nearly every church planter I know, myself included, is motivated by a heart for the evangel, a desire to see people come to saving faith in Jesus Christ. Church planters are practitioners with a bias towards action, and they often operate by the old slogan of Campus Crusade, now called Cru, who often would say, "I like how I do evangelism better than how you don't do it." On the other hand, there's some egregious forms of colonialism, and some of the most unchecked abuses of power have also come in the world of church planting. And so after day one, focusing on deconstructing, welcome again to day two of reconstructing through seeing church planting as the church's evangelism laboratory. So let's ask the question, why are church plants generally more effective in reaching people for Christ than established churches? Well, in his 2019 book, You Found Me, on the congregational practices of evangelism, Rick Richardson surveyed more than 4,500 North American churches. And he found that just 10% of those churches are experiencing conversion growth as opposed to transfer growth. And he calls these congregations conversion communities. And he identifies three common characteristics among them: a missional imagination, missional leadership, and missional congregational practices. And I think it's no coincidence that these characteristics are precisely what many healthy church plants are designed to cultivate from the start. So firstly, church planters are deeply motivated by a missional imagination. Richardson describes missional imagination as becoming re-enchanted by the power and beauty of the mission of Jesus, as well as recapturing a vision for the church as salt and light in the world. Again, nearly all the church planters I met have a strong sense of missional imagination, but what we sometimes call a holy discontent, right? Which is a frustration that some critical aspect of the gospel of Jesus Christ is missing in the contemporary church. And they imagine and envision some fresh expression of the body of Christ that can reach people for Christ that existing churches can't or won't. The church plant that I lead here in Pasadena, called Missio, was inspired after I began to realize that the nearby Caltech community and the scientific community was essentially an unreached people group that wasn't being reached by current churches or parachurch organizations. And we had a deep desire to help these young adults integrate science and faith, that they didn't have to choose one or the other. Or I think of Inez Velasquez McBride, an important part of the Fuller community, who in her own background was criticized in her own church for speaking Spanish, as if she never ought to. And she dreamed and envisioned a church community where the church could be familia, where they could be who they were culturally, linguistically, in all ways, a church community. And so she and her co-planter, Bobby Harrison, founded the church we hope for, also here in Pasadena, that intentionally seeks racial justice and reconciliation. And so a missional imagination can birth these new communities. The second characteristic is missional leadership, that in some parts of the church planting world, church planters are specifically selected and trained to live on mission. That Richardson says missional leaders are those who lead by example, cultivating friendships with the unchurched and creating a culture of mission in the church. Church planting networks and denominations, generally speaking, they actively seek out missional leaders with apostolic and evangelist gifts to start new churches. Alan Hirsch has popularized the framing of the leadership gifts from Ephesians 4 as APEST, an acronym for apostles, prophets, evangelists, shepherds, and teachers. And church planting movements ask the question, where have all the apes gone? The APEs, right? People with apostolic, prophetic, and evangelist gifts. Because Christendom, for the most part, has relied almost exclusively on STs, shepherd teachers. And that has hampered, in many ways, the mission of the church. And so church planting organizations often will host multi-day church planter assessments designed to identify and greenlight the apes to start new churches. So then those who are gifted and wired for church planting are then trained as missionaries to their cities, right? For instance, Fuller's own church planting certificate and the cohorts that we lead train planters to learn to read the host culture, to learn its heart language and rhythms, and to enter into it with a missional and incarnational posture. And by the way, I'm told that the holistic evangelism course that's part of that is on discount, and the code is on one of the upcoming slides. But much of church planter training is about contextualization, right? Contextualizing the gospel, helping planters to do neighborhood exegesis, learn how to articulate and embody the gospel in their specific context. And so church planters and their teams are asking questions like, who's already doing the work here? What is God, how is God already at work in our community? Is God raising up a person of peace to open doors for the gospel that we can partner with? And so these kinds of questions are ways to have a missionary posture towards the cities that we're trying to reach. I think of a church planting couple, Josh and Noemi Chavez, who planted Revive Church here in the Los Angeles area. And they learned in their own sort of exegesis of their community that 80 to 90% of the women who were at risk of being trafficked had come out of the foster care system. And so that church kind of made it their mission to sort of adopt essentially all the girls in the foster care system as a way to kind of get at the root causes of trafficking. And so they read their community and they responded. And then thirdly, Richardson identifies missional congregational practices as an important part of being conversion communities. And in a sense, planters and their teams are seeking to make church plants a whole conversion community, to have these congregational practices that they do together. And the church plants are birthed into existence out of a desire to impact their community with the gospel. And so the church planters will select leaders who share that church's evangelistic DNA. And church planting teams then often seek to live as a missionary community where they fan out across the city to identify groups receptive to the gospel, and then to seek to live and love one another such that they're embodying a countercultural and communal way of life that's attractive to the unbelieving culture. The church plant may adopt practices like prayer walking or gathering neighbors for backyard barbecues, or finding common ground with existing institutions like local schools or secular justice organizations or city government. Congregation members are trained to practice hospitality. And the Greek word used in the New Testament for hospitality is philoxenos, love of strangers, right? And if ever there was a time in the American church where we need to demonstrate hospitality to those of different political persuasions or racial backgrounds or sexual orientations, that time is now. Now, at the same time, the very evangelistic zeal that drives church planters and church planting organizations is the same thing that can lead to excesses and errors that cause many dones or nuns to leave or avoid the church in the first place. So let me briefly mention a few of those dysfunctional narratives, which were named earlier in this conference. There's the theological issue of triumphalism, that often the language and imagery used in church planting are phrases like parachuting in or taking a city for Christ, right? Militaristic and triumphalistic, or using the language of multiplication or exponential growth. It's not, It's not inherently wrong, but it can be sort of seen simply as like numerical growth for its own sake, up and to the right. There's the racial issue of colonialism, right? Much of the mainstream church planting world still operates on what Toby Kurth calls the white success story model, where the primary narrative has been that of a white, male, wealthy, suburban church planter who will often sport facial hair and skinny jeans and maybe a tattoo. And the racial reckoning that the evangelical church has grappled with has meant that church planting movements are now recognizing that planters, particularly white planters, that move into a city without knowing and building relationship and trust with the existing pastoral leaders and stakeholders, that they're often operating in a colonial rather than a collaborative mindset. This can also lead to gentrification, where church plant members join the yoga studios and the cold brew cafes in gentrifying a neighborhood and deepening the economic inequalities that generally fall along racial lines. There's the psychological issue of the narcissism and celebrity pastor culture that's been endemic in church plants. The recent fall of many prominent church planters has highlighted the reality that church planting attracts and even affirms narcissistic leaders. And if the church grows, those leaders are given more freedom and accolades, even as the checks and balances diminish. So what is the future of evangelism through church planting? Let me point to several hopeful trends and directions. The first is, I think there's a need for new narratives. For many decades, the imagination of U.S. pastors and planters has been held captive by the church growth movement's obsession with numerical growth. And that, of course, that the church growth movement was pioneered, for better and for worse, by Fuller Seminary's own Donald McGavran. And then following the church growth movement, there's been fear-mongering among church, around church decline as the counterpoint to that. My friend Daniel Yang, who will be responding later, writes that Gen Z, in particular, might be triggered by any vision that thinks the church can reclaim the culture, restore Sunday church attendance, and reverse religious decline by doing more of the same like previous generations. He says instead, Gen Zers need to feel they aren't part of advancing the cause of a declining religion. They need to feel as if they're part of what Jesus is doing to heal the nations. So a new narrative. Secondly, I think there's the proliferation of what I would call elastic ecclesiologies. That church planting is pushing the bounds of ecclesiology, of what makes church church. And it's led to, I think, a healthy multiplicity of models of church planting, including Launch Large, the missional incarnational movement, house church, micro church, and even metaverse church, right? We're moving towards a so-called blended ecology of church planting, where multiple models of church planting work in partnership to create a diverse and healthy ecosystem of churches for the sake of a city. Together, they can reach all the nations, panta ta ethne, that are gathered in our cities. And in this blended ecology, church planting networks and denominations partner together to form city-based church planting networks and movements that seek the welfare of the city, like the Houston Church Planting Network, which partners with over 120 churches across denominational lines to support church planters and to host church planting residencies. I think a third hopeful thing is the rise of diverse planters. There's these massive demographic shifts in our country, as you know, including just in the years from 2000 to 2019, according to Pew, a rise of 81% in Asian Americans and 70% in Latinos. That reality, combined with the profound racial divisions, mean that the gospel is going to need to be increasingly expressed and embodied in and through planters of color. And yet planters of color are often unseen by the mainstream church planting world, and they feel out of place both in ethnic churches and in predominantly white churches. And so there's a huge need to identify and affirm and send planters of color who will start both ethnic-specific churches and multi-ethnic churches to reach the most diverse generation in history. This means that this next generation of church planters and missionaries are going to need intercultural competencies, right, to proclaim and to contextualize the gospel to multiple cultures. They're going to need a commitment to co-plant with persons of other ethnicities so that they're planting not just diverse churches, but truly multi-ethnic churches that share leadership and share the platform. This also entails a real concerted effort to identify and train and coach planters of color. And that's a major focus of our current work at the Fuller Church Planting Initiative. Just yesterday at the conference, I was talking to some Ugandan planters who have a desire and vision to plant a church for immigrant and second generation Africans here in the greater Los Angeles area. And my respondent, Liz Rios, she leads Passion to Plant, which focuses on training Black and brown planters to serve and plant in underserved communities. So these are just some of the future trajectories that church planting and evangelism can take in the future. And on the whole, I still believe, even with all of its faults, in the mission and work of church planting, that it's a place and it's a means whereby congregation is intentionally embodying and expressing the good news of Jesus Christ in deeply contextualized ways. It's a significant and powerful learning lab and testing ground for the church's work of evangelism that flows back into the mainstream church and helps them grow and equips them for outreach. And so may the Spirit empower our work as evangelists through the work of missional leaders like church planters. Thank you. I now want to introduce our first respondent, Liz Rios, who, as I mentioned, leads Passion to Plant. She has worked for decades in this space of racial justice and integration. And so I look forward to dialoguing and for you to hear first from Liz.